did you know that in 2012, Pinotage was one of 5 cultivars that was added to the list of approved grapes that could be cultivated in France? It was added along with cultivars like Nebbiolo, Nero d'Avola, Touriga Nacional, and the Georgian Saperavi cultivar. But as of 2018, there was still only 1.5 hectares of Pinotage in France. And the Institut Français de la Vigne et du Vin described Pinotage as a cultivar suitable for rosé due to its high level of aromatic esters, which, to be honest, is a fairly epic vinifical diss. Outside of France, Pinotage exists in at least 9 other countries, including over 30 hectares in New Zealand and a vineyard in West Sussex in England on the estate of Leonardsley Gardens, where the vineyard fruit is used to produce sparkling wine. Now, today's HanDrinksSolo wine of the day is neither a rosé nor a sparkling wine. Instead, it is the Bredell Clarke Pinotage 2019, which is made with fruit from the farm of Rustenhof, situated in Stellenbosch's Helderberg area. Now, within the grand product branding Hall of Fame, one is unlikely to find a name like Bredell and Clarke. The moniker is hardly pithy, and at best, if it's memorable, it's only memorable in a kind of Rebecca Black sort of way. But the goal or aim of this name is not to cut through the white noise of social media and embed itself in your fast-twitch lizard brain. Rather, it has a much more admirable goal, albeit fairly niche, and that is to use the wine label to highlight 3 important roles between wine vines and the end wine drinker. And those 3 roles are the viticulturist, the winemaker, and the merchant or distributor, for lack of a better word. As consumers, we're au fait with fawning over winemakers and dressing them up as rock stars and dishing out informal knighthoods, especially when it comes to a winemaker like Bernard Bredell, who is roguishly handsome and the genius behind the wine label of Scions of Sinai. He also happens to be one of Tim Atkin's previous Young Winemakers of the Year. But we aren't quite as sure about how to celebrate our viticulturalists. And I think this is partially because it's much harder for us to connect what a viticulturalist does to what we are tasting in the glass. But the point to note here is that almost all of the winemakers that we are very happy to celebrate hold to the line that great wines are made in the vineyards. Now, if this is true, then we as consumers need to become more comfortable with connecting what a viticulturalist does to what we taste in the glass. But in assigning the role of winemaker to Bernard Bredell, I am inadvertently implying that there's some sort of Chinese war between the role of the viticulturalist and the winemaker, and that Bernard's job only really begins when the fruit reaches the cellar. But the truth about Bernard Bredell is that he is enormously involved with his vines. And in fact, in this particular instance, Bernard is winemaker and viticulturalist. The second Bredell on the label is Pieter Bredell, who's Bernard's cousin and also the owner of the farm Rustenhof. Now, Bernard and Pieter grew up together in the vines all the time, doing viticulture with their father and even their grandfather. They both went on to study enology and viticulture and majored in soil science. So the cousins of Pieter and Bernard really are 2 men who live out that line of great wines starting in the vineyards. And speaking of vineyards, the vines that produce the Pinotage fruit for this particular wine are certified old vine vineyards. They were planted in 1976 as bush vines, and they are farmed in a strict dry land farming practice, which means absolutely no irrigation is allowed. Now, if getting all doughy-eyed about a viticulturist seems like a tall order, getting emotional about a wine merchant or distributor is beyond the pale. To use an analogy, getting excited about a distributor is kind of like zooming in on the anus of an Indonesian civet cat. I mean, sure, we might, with our intellect, know that it is responsible for delivering a sublime sensory experience. But as a consumer, if we're honest, we'd really rather not have to think about it. So it is with distributors. But in the instance of Bredell Clarke Pinotage 2019, Clarke, or David Clarke, is way more than just a merchant or wine distributor. In fact, in this particular case, he is far more of a gatekeeper or playmaker, if you like, who was responsible for getting this wine into the bottle. As the story goes, the vines that produced the fruit for this particular wine came from the exact same vineyard that produces the internationally critically acclaimed Phoenix Pinotage, made by Bernard Bredell for his Scions of Sinai label. But winemaker Bernard Bredell, when wearing his viticulturist hat, was walking through the vineyards, tasting the fruit, and realized that it just didn't speak the same language as he had in mind for his lower alcohol, lighter expression, more aromatic, whole bunch style Pinotage. The way Bernard tells it, it was very obvious, as I say, even out in the vineyards when tasting the fruit, that this was going to be a slightly different expression. It was just a little more muscly and brooding, and ultimately outside of his vision for the Phoenix. So for a short time, it appeared as though this parcel of Pinotage would be lost forever to the world, were it not for David Clarke, who popped into Bernard's cellar to pay him a visit. David tasted the component and absolutely loved it. And by loved it, I mean like George Foreman level loved it, like loved it enough to put his name on it. Now, it's worth noting at this point that outside of being just a wine merchant and wine distributor, David Clarke is also a member of the Court of Master Sommeliers. And I add this in because it lends weight to my assertion that if David Clarke feels a parcel of fruit is worth rescuing from the proverbial threshing floor, or whatever the wine cellar version is of a threshing floor, then it's probably worth paying attention to. Or is it? Rather than wallowing in conjecture and speculation, we're going to get into the glass and let the wine speak for itself. Now, when we give this wine a sniff, I should note at this point, if you've poured it directly from the bottle, then what you're going to be greeted with is a lot of really moody, salted meat and game notes. But if you've given this wine a little bit of time to breathe or decanted it, then what you'll see is those smoky notes are a lot more toned down, and instead what starts to emerge are some really lovely, rather rich black plum notes, as well as fresh blackberry. And then there are redder fruit notes as well, a bit of cherry, some really lovely, rather fragrant raspberry, and a little touch of cocoa dusting right at the back. Now, when we give it a sip, well, we are greeted by quite a serious rendition of the grape. Now, Pinotage often gets a bad rap, either for being over-oaked or overripe, and the fruit is often described as things like velvety or dense or plush. But this particular guy has far more of a Cabernet feel to him. The palate is kind of medium weighted, but the tannins are really quite firm. The fruit is also quite tightly wound and a little more restrained. It's what one might call a muscly wine. And the fruit is quite serious too. So instead of just being ripe, plush plum, it's more like a more savory roasted plum. And when I talk about those blackberry notes, it's not ripe, juicy blackberry. It's more like a slightly wild blackberry with a savory sort of herbal sage element to it. And then, as I said, the tannins really are quite firm. And I think this guy could age easy for another 8 to 10 years. Okay, so that's all for today. But if you enjoyed the video, then support us on Patreon and subscribe to the HanDrinksSolo YouTube channel, where we publish at least 6 videos each month talking about things like wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars, and some of the rising winemaking and viticultural stars that are coming out of the dynamic South African wine.